All right. So, I have the pleasure of welcoming our next speaker, Thomas Brunner, Head of Custody, Staking, and DeFi at Sygnum Bank. That is a tall order, Thomas. Congratulations for this beautiful title. He will be addressing a very timely topic today about custody, and I'm not going to take much of your time. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Custody is widely viewed as a commoditized service with limited scope for innovation. So this is a quote I took from a report by HSBC called Custody in 2025. And of course, this report was mainly referring to custody in traditional finance for traditional securities. And I think if we talk about crypto custody, nothing could be further from the truth than what this statement says. And just in case you are not convinced of this, then let me highlight some recent events and headlines that show that there is a lot of movement and innovation going on in crypto custody. The first one, ERC 4337, which is about account abstraction. So this is something where Vitalik Buterin said that this is something he wanted to do for a long time. This would really be a big game changer in how we use crypto wallets. So I will talk about this in a few minutes. Hold on a moment for account abstraction. Then the second, headline, the acquisition of Metako by Ripple. Of course, Ripple, the entity behind the Ripple cryptocurrency, and Metako, the well-known Swiss provider of custody software solutions. And I think just one thing that this very clearly shows is that custody is seen as a strategic capability. Otherwise, I'm sure Ripple wouldn't have paid $250 million for Metako. And the third one, the ledger recover controversy. So I don't want to comment too much on whether this was justified or not, but I think it very clearly shows two things. The first one, that people have very strong opinions about custody, about wallets, about trust. And the second one, concerning trust, I think this very clearly showed that even if you do self-custody, if you use open source, you always need some level of trust, even if you do self-custody. But we are not here to talk about what's happening now. I would like to talk about what I think will shape custody in the future. And I picked three topics, and the first one is the decoupling from private keys. What does that mean? So in the early days, wallets were quite simple. You just had a private key, you took some randomness, you generate a private key, you derive an address from it, and then if you want to do a transaction, you just take the transaction, you sign it with your private key, and that's it. Like these days, if you want to operate an institutional grade custody solution, things get a little bit more complicated. And these are just some of the things that you have to consider when you think about institutional grade custody. You might, for example, use MPC or threshold cryptography, where you have not a single private key, but multiple key shares. You might also use key encryption keys. So this is basically keys that you use to encrypt critical key material. You might use key share, so maybe use something like Shamir secret sharing to split up a secret into multiple pieces. Of course, you need to deal with backups. And you might use a key derivation where you have a master seed, and from that you create many addresses instead of just one. But from a blockchain point of view, it's still basically the same as before. You have an unsigned transaction, You sign it with your private key or maybe with your MPC key shares, and then you have a signed transaction that you can submit to the blockchain. Now, if we talk about account abstraction, and here in this example, according to this Ethereum proposal, ERC 4337, this basically adds a whole new layer on top of the existing blockchain or on top of the execution layer in the case of Ethereum. So ERC 4337 introduces a concept they call user operations, and this is basically an operation that you typically do in a wallet. In the most simple case, it could be just a send out that you want to do. Then you put this user operation in a mempool, and here it's important to consider that this is not the usual blockchain transaction mempool, but it's actually another mempool that is in a, let's say, in a higher level or in a more abstracted level on top of the blockchain mempool. Then you have so-called bundlers. They basically take those user operations and send it to the so-called entry point smart contract. And this is a so-called singleton smart contract, a bit like the staking smart contract on Ethereum, and then sends your user operation to your smart contract wallet. Now, maybe you ask yourself why we do all these complicated things and what's the benefit. And I think the things that this enables are really quite powerful, because now you have the full power of smart contracts for your wallet. Just some examples that this would enable, for example, account recovery, social recovery, pre-authorized transactions. For example, maybe if you use crypto in a game, you can authorize your wallet to spend transactions for the entire gaming session. We can have sponsored transactions where basically the gas fees are paid by a paymaster, so a separate party. We can also have cases where we can pay transactions not only with ETH, but also, for example, with an ERC20. Obviously, as I'm sure some of you are aware, with ERC20s, that is often a bit cumbersome. It would enable subscription models where you could instruct your wallet to pay your monthly Netflix subscription. You can have spending restriction. And last but not least, you could also imagine a wallet that sort of automatically puts a portion of your tokens into a lending pool, for example. So I think obviously a very powerful concept if it gains traction, and it would certainly enable a lot more things that we can't even imagine today. The second topic I would like to mention is the separation of exchanges and custodians. This gentleman here is Bernie Madoff. So some 15, 20 years ago, he was a well-respected and well-known investment manager on Wall Street. The problem was that he was basically a fraud. So what he did, he took new investor money and used this to honor withdrawal requests from previous investors. So essentially, he just operated, in the end, quite a simple pyramid scheme, and he sort of created fake trades and fake statements. And what I think is quite striking are of course, the similarities to SBF. And when you look what the SEC did after this Madoff scandal, you see that they amended what is called the SEC custody rule, and they changed it in a way that to enforce a much stricter separation between the custodian and for example, the investment manager. You had to do a lot more reporting and internal control, audits, and things like that. And now, in 2023, of course, after the FTX scandal, the SEC is again amending the SEC custody rule. They will now call it the safeguarding rule. And in their proposal, so for now it's just a proposal, they propose further sort of separation of custodians and other entities, and also, and I think that would have a big impact on crypto, it would extend the scope of the rule to include crypto as well. What this would mean for US registered investment advisors, that they would not be able to use self-custody, they would not be able to use centralized exchanges anymore, and they would be basically forced to use qualified custodians. So for now, this is just a proposal. Nevertheless, the change that this would bring, I think, is that we would move from the model that we see on the left to what we see on the right. Like on the left, you see how centralized exchanges look like today, like FTX was like that. Basically, they are fully vertically integrated. You have the custodian, exchange, the broker. It's all together under one roof. And of course, such a setup is what made fraud possible in the case of FTX, but also some 15, 20 years earlier in the case of Bernie Madoff. And I think what we will see is for sure a cleaner separation of between the exchange and the custodian. That would essentially mean that exchanges would become non-custodial, like we already have them in the decentralized world, where all the exchanges are already non-custodial. But in the centralized world, it's still, very much custodial. Then the last trend or topic I want to mention is embedded crypto finance. Obviously, we have more and more use cases where we use a crypto wallet, where we have crypto. I think in the future we will have crypto always, almost everywhere. And embedded finance, and I borrowed a definition from McKinsey here, basically means that you have finance embedded in a sort of a non-financial customer experience, in a non-financial customer journey, or in a non-financial platform. And obviously, embedded crypto finance means that basically we have crypto everywhere in non-financial applications, platforms, for example, games, in the metaverse, and so on. Yes, so those are the three trends that I wanted to mention. Firstly, the decoupling of private keys from addresses with account abstraction. Secondly, I think the further separation of exchanges and custodians, even in the centralized world. And then thirdly, embedded crypto finance, which essentially means that we will have crypto almost everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas.